action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing and advertising. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today I've caught Murray Calder. One of the finest strategic minds in the industry, Murray learnt his craft managing internationally renowned Scotch whisky brands like the Macallan, Highland Park and the Famous Grouse, where he oversaw the global relaunch. He's been with MediaCom Edinburgh since 2006, where he is currently strategy director, and numerous honours bestowed on his bonce include a period as chairman for the IPA in Scotland. But arguably trumping all of this is the fact he's the first Call to Action guest to have had a previous show dedicated to them. And it's due to JP Hanson's recommendation that I am now saying, welcome to the show, Murray.
Thanks very much. Nice to be on it.
Quick fire questions. Coffee or tea?
Tea.
Book or Facebook?
Book.
Vinyl or MP3?
Vinyl.
Robert Burns or Robert the Bruce?
Oh, that's a tough one for a Scotsman, isn't it? Yeah, Robert Burns, I think. Burns, I think.
Another one coming up then. Sean Connery or Billy Connolly?
Oh, Billy.
And this one's ridiculous, so apologies, but bagpipes or bagpuss?
Oh, I was a massive fan of bagpuss when I was a kid.
Johnny Walker or Johnny Cash?
Oh, Johnny Cash.
Nice. And mountains or sea?
Oh, God, that's impossible. I live by the sea, but I love the mountains. Can I have both?
No.
Oh, mountains then.
You can have both.
I'd rather be on the mountains than in the sea, put it that way.
So I think it's important to hear that talented people in our industry don't always take that short, straight path from school or college straight to career. So how did you end up as a marketer, and did you have any weird, odd, rogue jobs beforehand?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is completely by random. I mean, I certainly didn't have any plan then to become a marketeer. I'm not entirely sure I've got a plan at the moment, but I guess like most people, I started off as a paper boy. It's like, so school jobs, paper boy. I think, although that was really to fund skiing. In fact, most of the jobs I had when I was, I think before I graduated from university, were entirely to fund going skiing, up to the point where I took a job as a ski instructor in Scotland because it was the only way I could afford to ski, because it is not a cheap sport, to be honest. But no, I didn't do a marketing degree. I didn't have a plan to work in marketing. When I left university, I joined Ainsley Insurance, who were the student insurers, still are a student insurance probably, in a management trainee scheme, which I failed miserably at. I was no good at it at all. So selling insurance over the counter wasn't for me. And this was, it was foolish because I should have stuck in a bit more, because it was right in the teeth of a recession, the early 90s. And so I was unemployed for quite a long time, which was great because I had lots of time to go rock climbing and spend time in the mountains. But I was applying for, 50 jobs a week. And in the days when jobs were advertised in the back of the newspaper, I'd send a letter off to almost anything that I was in fact, things I wasn't even vaguely qualified for. And I finally got an interview for a job, which I still remember the advert, which was Person Friday for Busy Friendly Office, which turned out to be a company called the Macallan Langs Partnership, which was a joint venture between the Macallan Glenlivet PLC and Lang Brothers, both Scotch whisky companies, and was basically a drinks distributor based in Glasgow. So distributed Macallan products, Lang Brothers products, but also Heidsick champagnes, Faustino wines, a couple other bits and pieces, and Galliano. And I suppose the first job I had in marketing was a side project as Person Friday, i.e. T-Boy, to come up with a marketing project for Galliano in Scottish ski resorts. It's almost inconceivable to even say that. But I was very fortunate that Robin Lambie, who was the marketing director at Macallan Langs Partnership, gave me the chance to do that, and I found doing that actually this is quite interesting, and it's kind of stretched my mind a little bit and made me stop and think that this might be something I could be interested in. So I guess that was the very first thing. But not very long after that happened, Macallan Langs Partnership folded, was dissolved, and Robin headed back up to Macallan Glenlivet PLC on Speyside, and I'd obviously done enough with the Galliano project to end up being offered a job up at Macallan, and so moved up to Speyside, where I didn't do any marketing for a couple of years, but I did dry goods ordering. I worked in the distillery itself. I was a tour guide around the distillery. I arranged export shipping. I did pretty much all of the jobs except marketing at the distillery for a couple of years. Which was a fantastic grounding in knowing about whiskey and knowing about the product that I ended up, I guess, kind of eventually was given the opportunity to become marketing assistant for Macallan. So there you go.
Wow. So how did you take that I was going to say sidestep, but it's much bigger than a sidestep into covering every other role and then going into marketing?
Well, I guess I was at the time I was just really happy to have a job. I mean, lots of my friends didn't have jobs. It was pretty rough back then. Like it is now, I think, for new graduates. There's not a lot out there, and it's hard to find your first chance. And so I think I had enjoyed, the 18 months or so I'd been at Macallan Langs, and had kind of got a bit interested in drinks, other than the student interest that I had in drinks before then. And so the chance to go and work in a distillery was actually quite interesting. Not only that, I mean, I'd actually grown up in the northeast for large parts of my life, so it was a part of the country I knew. So I wasn't going in completely blind to that part of the world. And the distillery is in a beautiful part of the country. It is, it's a well-respected distillery, and this was this was probably right at the height of Macallan Glenlivet PLC's powers, shortly before the takeover by Highland Distillers, and I was working with some of the best people in the business, and I still say today, I learnt so much, not just at Macallan Glenlivet, but subsequently at Highland and then at Edrington from some of the best people I think in marketing, and certainly the best people in drinks marketing. So I think the sideways step, I think, was actually a good thing. To have such a fundamental understanding of the product that you're marketing. I mean, I do come across people occasionally today who don't seem to know as much about their product and where it comes from and how it's made, and as you might expect. And I think that and I think that, so actually being in the distillery, taking foreign journalists around the distillery and explaining to them in German why Macallan was better than other distillers because of X, Y, and Z was a real proper grounding in understanding product, which at the end of the day is the foundation of everything we do in marketing and advertising. It's like, there is no product, there's nothing to market or advertise. So, and I think we often forget that. And we, I see an awful lot of marketing and advertising trying to make up for the fact that nobody's really thought about the product very much. And I guess, I was very lucky to work in Scotch Whisky, where actually the product is pretty sacrosanct, or at least certainly was at that time anyway.
So with that experience in the whiskey world and industry, can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of marketing in such a regulated arena? Because I think too many are unclear on the restrictions alcohol brands face, not to mention potential moral questions that can arise. So what were those challenges?
Oh, goodness, it's funny. I'm not sure that at the time. I think it's interesting. It's a matter of perspective, isn't it, or state of mind? Is that I didn't really look at it from a perspective of pros and cons, and you look at it from the perspective of actually these are constraints on what we can do, and that actually makes you think harder about what you can do. You've got to be really creative to get around some of those things. So I mean, there are moral questions, particularly in some cultures more than in others, and that international aspect is quite important to remember. So there are huge high barriers to entry in whiskey. You can't just suddenly start making Scotch whisky. There's quite a lot of, you have to have a distillery for starters. You've got to wait for at least 3 years, and for malt generally 10 or 12. So there's actually quite restricted competition, and that's in that sense. Actually, you kind of know who your competitors are, and they're not an awful. At least at that point, there weren't an awful lot of new entrants to the market. So I guess that's a pro. And a lot of international markets, there are high tariffs. So actually, you could look at that as, okay, that's depressing our sales. But actually, if you look at it from another perspective, actually that creates aspiration. It creates scarcity of demand, and we all want things we can't have. Yeah. And so from an image perspective, it creates massive opportunities from a marketing perspective. And I guess the fact that so much of the cost of a bottle of whiskey, almost wherever you are, is actually cost of goods and tax, means that actually the margins might not be what you think you are, and actually therefore the budget scale and spending. If you look at yes, there are big budgets in whiskey brands, but compared to a lot of big FMCG brands, they're very small. And so actually those restrictions force you to think about innovation in a far more focused way. You've got to be really, really clear about what you're spending your money on. And I think probably the major pro that at least from a personal perspective that I had from working in the whiskey industry was the level of financial scrutiny and financial management of brands really kind of gave me a phenomenal grounding in how to understand what marketing should and shouldn't be trying to do in a business sense, and not just in a too much of marketing now I think is looked at as a marketing as comms. Well, that's only a tiny part of it, and actually when you're looking at this from a full P&L perspective, it makes you stop and think a little bit more about the other parts of the marketing mix and what you need to do to make sure that when you get to the point of briefing comms, you've got all the rest of the pieces lined up in place to make sure you make the most of that investment.
Couldn't agree more. We've touched on the perception that marketing is just comms in a couple of previous episodes, both with Frederick Hallberg and JP Hansen more so. The consistency there is we regularly conclude there's a real lack of strategy in marketing nowadays. We've started calling it the Shergar of marketing here because we've got no idea where it's gone. Can you tell our listeners then, firstly, what is strategy to you? And secondly, how do you go about creating one?
Oh, okay. Big question. What is strategy? I think.
So I've gone straight in with these big questions. Apologies.
No, that's fine. Yeah. So what is strategy? I think at its best, it's a decision-making tool. That's what it is. It's a tool that allows you to decide: make this, don't make that; do this, don't do that; say this, don't say that; spend this, don't spend that; spend it here, don't spend it there. And it should really be the touchstone that you keep coming back to in all of your marketing efforts, and I mean marketing in its broadest sense. So should we milk this brand, or should we invest in it? Is there an opportunity for us to extend this brand through new product development? And if so, what type of new product development? And is that something that works for us or doesn't work for us? Which market should we be in? Which people should we be marketing to? I mean, all of these things are derived from strategy. And so I think well conceived and expressed strategy makes it easy to make decisions. That for me is what is at the heart of good strategy.
I think I'm at risk of potentially offending previous guests, but that's right up there with my favourite ever explanation of what a strategy is. I think mostly because you've said it's do this, but don't do that. And it's the don't bit that people forget about. It's normally let's do this, let's do a bit of that. And even when it comes to targeting these people, strategy should say also we're not targeting these people or this segment.
Absolutely. I think I think so much of what we see in marketing and advertising these days is additive. It's what else can we do? And actually, I mean, I'm quite reductionist in my approach in any case, and it's that it's back to that. I didn't have time to make the shorter stuff. Is actually how can you make this simple? As simple as it needs to be, and no simpler. But certainly no more complicated. And I think that's getting to a simple expression of your strategy makes it easier for you to decide the things that you don't do. And actually, that's an interesting flip of the way that quite often people look at it, is actually thinking, what are the things we shouldn't do, as opposed to constantly looking for the more things to do.
Yeah, and equally, that's it's a really wanky word, but that's really empowering for a brand to say, well, let's switch this off. We don't need to be doing that. Your point about keeping it simple and the whole, I wouldn't I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. And there's similar quotes attributed to Churchill and all sorts of people, but it's so very true. And that importance of clarity is something I know you've talked about previously, especially in briefs. So I know it's not necessarily the same point, but that importance of simplicity and clarity is key. And am I right in thinking you used to run briefs past your mum and dad, and if they didn't get it, it wasn't right?
Yeah, briefs and more often presentations, particularly if I was going to go and present to a board, either my own when I was working client side or somebody else's when I moved client agency side. It's that we are, as an industry, we are terrible for filling space with shit. Proper bullshit, and you look at some of the words that are used are words that you would never use in a general conversation with somebody, and I think that we forget that we forget often that the people that we're speaking to, and I use people advisedly, in agencies and client side and consumers, they're people, right? And they're people like you and me who go down the pub and have a chat about stuff in words of one syllable. Now, that's not. I'm not in no way being anti-intellectual here, and there's certainly a place for the intellectualism that comes of deep thought and flow and understanding the fundamentals of mental models that can help you describe things. But you need to try and express that in a way that anybody can understand. And the simpler and the easier it is to understand, the clearer the brief is, and therefore the more likely it is you will get an outcome that suits what you're trying to achieve. I see briefs that are pages long, filled with all sorts of stuff. If you've got everything in the brief, you can answer with everything. There's no clarity there in terms of what is required in order to answer this. And I think that's the first. There's a lot of good stuff kicking about recently, and I've seen quite a lot of people talking about this. Is that be very clear on what your problem is. Make your strategy simple, and that will help you build out the tactics that you need in order to achieve your goals.
In its basic state, any piece of communication is going from A to B, and the more words or the more jargon, whatever it is that you put in there, is just lengthening that distance for that communication. So we talk here internally about trimming the fat when it comes to especially copywriting. If you can take a word out and it still makes sense, it shouldn't have been there, or it doesn't really add anything, pretty basic stuff. But the same is true with any piece of communication. You want something to be received by a person or whatever the entity is. So keep that short and simple. Otherwise, you're making it either take longer or appear ambiguous. And it sounds so simple. This stuff always sounds really simple when you say it out loud. But actually, if you take a look around you and see what the output is, it's as if they forget. Yeah,
I'm sure that's an element of it. But I think there's almost there's a I don't know whether it's a human need or what it is, but there's we want to show our workings. And I think especially if you're a agency presenting to a client, or if you're a client presenting to their board, there's sometimes you end up trying to show that you've done some work, as opposed to showing that you have a clarity of thought and an answer that will meet the needs that you currently have as a business. And so there tends to be an impetus towards creating lots of stuff because we're being paid for this, or I'm being made to justify myself to my board for this investment I have to make. So I have to demonstrate that I've done a lot of thinking, I've done a lot of work. But actually, I think that's a misunderstanding of what thought should be. The more thought you put into it, the simpler you should be able to make it. I'll put my hands up. I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I quite often I'll over-engineer something, certainly the first time round. But I do kind of often try and remind myself and those around me that look, what can we take out of this to make it as clear and compelling as we possibly can.
Presumably that was very effective for you to get mum and dad or whoever it may have been to read the brief and feedback.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, my dad's a civil engineer. My mother was a teacher, and latterly a principal teacher of learning support. And so I think I was very fortunate in that I had people who were one very straight talking engineer and another person who understands the importance of making things simple for people to understand them. So they were great in that sense. And my dad would tell me that's a load of bollocks. And my mum would go, actually, why are you using words like that when you could be using words like this? But I think it's good practice, even if you don't go outside your work group or your agency or etc. Is to find somebody who's not working on that piece of business, who isn't dealing with, who doesn't have the baggage that you have in dealing with that client or that problem or that brand, and get them to look at it and say, well, that doesn't make sense, or this is what you're actually trying to say here because it's flabby. So even a 5-minute, I'm kind of often trying, as I develop presentations or briefs, etc., is getting other people involved. And I think there's a lot of people, and myself included, when I was younger, not that much younger, a tendency to hold on to stuff and try and do it all myself. And actually, there's real power in accepting that you don't have all the answers and that you need outside input and stimulus and criticism to make your work the best it can be.
You use the term there, saying something was flabby. I think that's a great way of describing something. And it's good, in fact, really, that you said it was your dad who would give you that no nonsense feedback.
Yeah.
I heard a great metaphor for a successful agency client relationship recently, and it was that the agency should be less like your mum or your nan, where everything's great and lovely and yes, they agree, and more like your like a personal trainer at the gym who challenged you to make hard decisions, but ultimately there was success in whatever guise it took. So having that refreshing no nonsense feedback is so important, and whether that's a conversation with your dad over a brief or just a conversation with a client, if you're saying the same stuff as someone else, then one of you's redundant.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. And I think that's one of the fundamentals I think about good client agency relationships, is that there is a level of trust and honesty there that allows that type of discussion and conversation to take place, so that you don't feel as if you have to pull your punches, that you can be honest about the feelings you have about something, and quite often feelings are just as, if not often more important than the rational thinking that you've got about a proposal or something you've got to say to your boss. So stop and think about those things, and so I guess one of the fundamental things that's occurred to me relatively recently is that actually the first and probably most important task that anybody responsible for client agency relationships on both sides of that relationship is about creating a safe space, a place where people can be honest and open about the challenges that they're facing.
Wise words. Now, you studied economics at the University of Glasgow, so you've got a solid training to touch on the role of economists in agencies, and yet there's various quotes I could put to you. One of my favourites is from Rory Sutherland, who says marketing is the science of understanding what economists are wrong about. I suppose what I want to understand more and more specifically is various commentators and industry experts have concluded that a lot of the problems in the industry are because we've got economists running agencies who do everything by spreadsheet. What's your take on that as a reflection of the state of the industry and that preceding quote of Rory's?
First of all, it's probably worth pointing out that saying I studied economics might be pushing it a little bit, given the degree I got and the fun I had at university. But anyway, and I think there's probably and I think there's a difference between studying economics and being an economist, and I think there's also a difference between being an economist and being the type of person who is running a multinational group of agencies. Accountants are not economists. Economists are not accountants. And so, counting numbers is one thing, and economics is actually the study of how scarce resources are managed. It's kind of how do you create the most utility from the resources you have at your command, whether those resources are financial or people resources or raw materials or whatever those are. And I think the thing that and Rory has a point in that I think historically classical economics was quite maths and models based and really didn't take any account of observed behaviour. It assumes all sorts of things which are entirely untrue about how people make decisions. And I guess, and Rory comes from that perspective, and rightly so, because of his interest and knowledge of behavioural economics and how important that has become in the industry. And so I think there's a big difference between what economics was even when I was studying at university, what economics is now, and behavioural economics, and how those things have changed over time. So I think the only bit I take issue with in Rory's thing is marketing a science. So there's an art to it as well, I think. So I think it's not an, and I think that we often get into these binary discussions, and I think it's another thing the industry is terrible for, is creating false binary things that just, they don't move things forward. They create conflict where there really isn't any, because actually it's both art and science, and a lot of what we do. And I think who was it? Somebody posted something the other day that I totally bought into, which is that we're just, a lot of us are just making up as we go along. We're making informed guesses.
I think it was a Bob Hoffman blog this week.
It was Bob. That's right. Yes, it was Bob this week. His piece this week, which I thought was bang on, right? Which is, there's a lot. We know a lot more now than we did. I mean, I was very fortunate when I was in the whiskey industry that we were, Edrington or Highland, I think it probably was before Edrington days. I can't remember which order, but we were one of the first people to buy into the Edinburgh Bass Studies work that was coming out in a big way, and so I came into contact with that quite early on in my career, which was fortunate. But I think that was always balanced with the understanding that we're talking about people, and no matter how much data, no matter how much how good your spreadsheet or your model is, we're dealing with people. People are too complex, and especially a lot of people is such a chaotic system that no model can account for what's going to happen. And so a bit of it has to be done with gut feel as much as it has to be done with data. And so I think we've created another false binary between it's either a creative director who's creating a phenomenal piece of art, or it's a media planner who's using a model to decide where X and Y happen. And it's clearly a combination of the both. And actually, all of the best work I've ever been involved in, both client side and agency side, has been where there's been a true partnership between both sides of that supposedly binary thing. It's where you've got a super creative agency, you've got a really nailed on media agency, but both can see each other's perspective, and a client who is prepared to listen to both sides of that argument and make decisions based on their knowledge of their brand and the people they're trying to sell their brand to. And actually getting those three parts of things together is magic when it happens. It really is.
I think the term false binary actually articulates it perfectly, because as you say, it applies to so much, and things are so rarely black or white. It's always a shade of grey somewhere.
It depends, right?
Exactly that.
I think there's another piece. There was another piece today. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but the gist of it I'm getting is that we're very good at reinforcing. We'll latch onto a model or a piece of insight, and we're very good at reinforcing that, because that becomes the truth. Those things become reinforced. In fact, JP, I think, was talking about this, is that, if you look at business, but everybody using the same business books, it means that you end up having the same opinion about the same stuff, and that creates zero competitive advantage. So how do you actually take the best of what's out there, but actually apply that in a way that allows for creativity and allows for the specifics of the context that you're operating in, whether that's the context of the brand you have, or the context of the market you're in, or the context of the people you're trying to sell to.
Yeah, it's a great point by JP. I think he shared that on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. I do remember seeing that. And whether you're of the we should be distinct or we should be different camp, or somewhere in between, which is probably where most people are or should be, if you're all starting with the same ingredients, and in this form he's talking about all the same type of education, it's the same input, then how is the output going to be distinct or different, or both?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are only so many shades of brown you can make from that set of colours, right? So actually, what you want is something a bit brighter than that.
Yes. I have to thank Dave Trott for sharing this quote with us earlier. We were desperately trying to find who to attribute this quote to. It was made by John Ward, and he said that advertising is a craft executed by people who aspire to be artists, but assessed by those who aspire to be scientists. So that's not another deliberate prod at accountants and economists, but I do think there's something there. Again, it's not binary, but I do think there's something there.
Yeah, that's a great quote, actually, and I think that's the really great account people are the people who can translate between those two camps. They are the people who can take what the accountant thinks and distill it into something that inspires a creative, and in the same way can take what a creative delivers and inspire people who are looking at numbers with it, to the point where actually suddenly they can see where those numbers lead to if you think like this. So yeah, that's a great quote. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting you were saying you adopted the finding the Ehrenberg, Bass and school of thought early on, but exactly as you also then went on to say is you can't simply replicate models. I think one thing that's becoming abundantly clear as we record more episodes is I simply just regurgitate wiser people's stuff and hope it reflects on me. Of course it doesn't, but we've got quotes from the likes of Ogilvy and Birnbach and all the greats literally printed as posters dotted around our office, and one of them is specifically that people are so complex that for whatever reason something might have worked previously, that could be the reason why it doesn't work again if you were to replicate it, simply because you've lost that impact or that feeling of new. So to take a model and replicate it, whether we're discussing the benefits of, I don't know, digital or what's perceived as traditional, I think a lot of it comes back to that point, which is why Rory's work and the other works of like Richard Shotton and all the very wise people working in the behavioural economics and psychology space need to be understood and taken seriously.
I totally agree. I mean, I think you see it even in creative work or in media planning, is that somebody does something new and different, and suddenly in the next year everybody has reimagined that model. So the way that somebody was talking earlier, there was copywriting. It was Sam Brearley, I think, was talking about just grammar isn't necessarily the rule that a copywriter should follow. Otherwise, think different would never have occurred. And then there was a discussion around that, which was yeah. But then that's that. We've got to blame that for us. The nounification of stuff, and you go like, well, yes, but that's not the fault of the people who first came up with that idea. That's the fault of the people who didn't have an idea after it. And so it's very easy to copy and hope that because it has worked for other people, it will work for you. And of course, the more people that do the same thing, the less distinctive and different it becomes. And the less distinctive and different it becomes, as we know, the less effective it is. So that's a real kind of imperative towards innovative thought and innovative action. So yeah,
Tom Roach and his motley crew at BBH Labs made a very similar observation recently, looking at challenger banks and people operating in that space, and he picked out one, showed their advertising and comms and especially their outdoor media campaigns, and over the space of 12 months the amount of other challenger brands popping up and copying them created this sea of sameness, which is exactly to your last point, is that something stands out for being different. Over time everyone copies them and they're all the same, so someone needs to be different again. It's this kind of ongoing battle for standout.
Yeah, and I think and as as the Edinburgh Bass stuff will show you that actually, and we see this, if a market leader has done something interesting and innovative and the rest of the people in the market are following it and they spend money behind that, that just reinforces the market leader's position. Because actually the people because actually that thing is associated with the market leader, and therefore actually reinforcing that thing in the marketplace just creates an even stronger bond in people's minds between the market leader and that attribute of the market. So
we were talking about that today, funnily enough, looking at a client's positioning and what they can kind of own. But exactly as you say, once you own that thing, if someone else starts using that term or that attribute, whatever it might be, all you're doing in part is promoting your often bigger competitor.
Yeah, and can you ever truly own something? I mean, how often does that ever happen?
No, it's very true. There's a few examples. I mean, and again, it's based on so much context in the individual. So an example that someone in the agency gave earlier was that when you think of Volvo, for example, you often think of safe, or you associate safety with Volvo, albeit whilst I haven't driven a Volvo recently, I'm sure they're fantastic cars. I do know, because we've double checked, that they're rarely finish first in safety tests when there is a comparison of brands, but because they went to put so much effort to own that association, there's I think there's a few examples out there, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, Byron would probably tell you that's because they invested so heavily over such a long period of time in the idea of safety, that's become, they've created that memory link in people's minds. So safe equals Volvo, Volvo equals safe. So yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mentioned in the intro you had a spell as chairman for the IPA. Can you tell us what that role entails, really? Because I think a few of us really have sight of or an understanding of that. And is there a highlight of yours during your time there?
Goodness. So I mean, just to what does the role involve? So it's a 2-year stint generally. And it means being certainly in Scotland at least, and there are other regional chairs as well. So that, and I think that's which is a great initiative from the IPA in order to make it not as London centric, I think, as perhaps sometimes the industry comes across. But the role of chair in Scotland is to be the spokesperson for the industry in Scotland, and that means to government and to the media. It's also about building bridges between advertising and other sectors. And in some respects, it is events convener might be an idea. So not that I did the legwork. There's Sarah and Sonia in the IPA team in Scotland did all of the legwork, but it is about thinking about, okay, well, how can we serve the membership best? By getting, and in my instance, that, and I think most chairs get instances, that is about who are the interesting people we can get to come to Scotland and speak to the membership about the things that are important in the industry. And I think, for me, collaboration was the big theme for me in the period that I was there. It's really about how do we get people speaking to each other, understanding each other a bit better, so that we can create better work in Scotland. I mean, we got some really interesting people to speak, but I think that probably for me was representing to government the importance of advertising as a sector within the Scottish economy. It's not really something that the Scottish business thinks mostly about. When you think of Scottish business, you think of engineering and you think of whisky, but actually the creative industries and to a large extent advertising are huge. And there are some great agencies up here doing great work, and I think representing that to government was probably, for me, was one of the highlights that I had, was making sure that the contribution of the industry was recognised.
That's important stuff, increasingly so, I believe. We've covered career and kind of work, but what about play? So I know you inherited a lot of wood type, you lucky sod,
Yep.
And you now spend a decent amount of time with print and print processes and so on and so forth.
I do, yeah. I'm very fortunate. My wife's a graphic designer, and her father was a printer and typesetter all his days. He's still alive, but he's retired now. And we found quite a lot of wood type in his basement, which was rotting away, and restored it, and bought myself a little press and started playing about with it a year or two ago. And subsequent to that, I've started carving lino, and more recently started kind of carving wood blocks to print with wood blocks. And it's one of those, I don't know, it's like, there's a lot to chat about mindfulness, but this is for me, it's such a endlessly fascinating topic. The endless combinations of type, letters, images, endless possibilities with carving wood, endless variations of paper and ink and pressure. So it's a proper rabbit hole to fall down, but there's something immensely satisfying about working with your hands and actually switching off. So especially when you work with your mind all the time, and have done for all my working life, to now have something that I do with my hands feels really important. And actually gives, and there's lots of stuff around kind of how your mind works, but actually being able to have that switch my mind off into kind of idling time actually creates quite a lot of positive outcomes in the thinking part of the job, as well as in the printing part of the job. So I think it's actually really important, I think, to have an interest that isn't work. And I think I probably said, and I've made this comment before in previous conversations I've had, but I think I probably, like a lot of us, hadn't realised how tied up my own self-worth and identity was in work, and I'd probably kind of overlinked those two things, and so it's really nice to have something else that now creates up more of my identity, and I'm very careful now to make sure that there's more to me than work. Because actually, and I think there's a great David Ogilvy quote that I came across earlier this year, was around speaking to a copywriter who was in the office too late, I think, and David saying that actually, you can only write effectively for 2 to 3 hours a day, and part of your job is to spend the rest of your day making yourself interesting enough that people want to read what you're writing. Which is a beautiful, which is a really actually beautiful thing around the how do you create the right balance between understanding the world and taking that understanding and making it relevant to the work that you do, because we're all of us, I think, spend far too much time at our desks staring at a screen, and I'm a big fan in my work and generally of getting up and walking about and going and speaking to people and spending time out doing things, because that's where you learn how things work, and that's where you can observe people. It's where you can observe people doing the things that you're trying to influence, and so I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Yeah, you make some really good points there, and your point about remaining interesting. Similar quote I've heard: "The greatest people know stuff about stuff," which is. I think it's key, and equally exactly what you just said. Giving your mind that off state temporarily is so healthy, and maybe I like to think it's increasingly hard to do. Maybe that's just it's like a generational thing. We always think, oh, it's harder than it used to be, but maybe that's likely bullshit. But I think with smartphones and that state of always being on so common, it's so difficult to find that time. And that's not an excuse. We need to find that time. But it's such a good point you make.
It is an excuse. It is an excuse.
It is an excuse. Yeah, I know. It's because you made me so depressed because I realise how much I don't give myself that time, which is a good thing because I think most of us fall into that trap. And your prints, then, I've seen quite a few that you've shared online. They seem to have quite a Japanese influence. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, I think probably. I've long been a fan of Japan. In fact, Emma, my wife, and I went to Japan while we were courting. It was kind of one of those formative trips, and it's just such a fascinating place. It's such that juxtaposition of ancient and modern, super modern, futuristic. In fact, it's just that it's just an endlessly fascinating place. I mean, it's had its ups and downs as a nation, as a culture, but the idea of craft. And this, the crafts that have been there for thousands of years being perfected alongside stuff that you never even imagined was possible. It's just that I just love that juxtaposition that in Japan, and so when I started getting into printing, and especially into carving blocks, that Japanese wood block printing, which I'm a fan. I mean, I'm a big fan of like graphic art in any case. So that the way that is produced and the way that and the effects that it creates really appeals to me from an aesthetic perspective. But what makes it stick with me is the craft that is behind that. And I'm totally fascinated by it, and I am in no way, shape, or form anywhere near delivering something like that. But as an aspiration, I think it's a great thing to say. Look, one day, if I stick at this, maybe I'll make something that looks like a poor imitation of some of that.
And I know you mentioned your wife there, so I know you've recently opened, or perhaps I should say, sorry, she's recently opened the Makery. Can we find any of your prints there?
Yes. So yes. So my wife opened a shop on Dunbar High Street where we live a month ago. First time in retail. She's been selling in other places for the last few years, but yeah, she's super talented graphic designer and artist and jewellery maker. And we'd basically run out of space in the house. So, and in fact, I'm sitting here in a room surrounded by boxes of stuff still, which we still haven't moved into the shop. But it's given Emma and myself a space to do stuff in, and yeah, I sell a couple of bits and pieces in there, which I have been astonished that some people have actually bought. Yeah, that's all very new, and Emma's doing an amazing job. It's just the fact that she's taken that leap into retail is. I'm full of admiration for her. So because it's not an easy game, retail, and it's not an easy time economically for a new retail store to open. But the response has been really positive so far. So I'm kind of hoping that will continue to be a success for her.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy time in big high streets, let alone, and I say this having never been to Dunbar, but what I understand is the footfall on Dunbar's high street is probably far less than it is in the big retail areas that are struggling.
It's not Oxford Street, that's for sure.
No, well, not yet. So we'll put a link to the Makery on the episode page because I browsed some of the paper cut, and there's all sorts of stunning things there. So I think most of our listeners, if not all, have a similar interest in design of all sorts of forms and guises. So we'll stick a link in there, and I recommend everyone listening to at least check it out. And then aside from that, you have a significant love of music.
Yes, yeah, I'm quite into my music. I still have a semi-regular night that I play at. So yeah,
what do you play?
What do I play? I play well, kind of at the moment. It's mostly funk, soul, and disco. Although I still occasionally get sucked back in and play some house, but and a bit of Afrobeat stuff. Yeah, but basically anything that'll move feet. It's just one of the best feelings in the world is to play a song and watch people dance. Getting a reaction to the music you're playing is still one of the most amazing feelings you can possibly have. Especially when you see a room going off to music you're playing, it's just like, oh, it totally feels amazing. So yeah, music's still a big thing. It has been for a long time. I wasn't a DJ for in my early years. I'm relatively late to it, but once you start, it's really hard to give up.
Yeah, but it's using your hands again.
Well, it is that, and I think music's such a primal, fundamental part of being human. I think it's a really important thing, music. And it's a thing that can really bring people together. So watching a group of strangers come together on a dance floor, dancing to the music you're playing is a joyful thing to see. So yeah, I'm totally into that.
I've very limited experience of that, but it is something I'd quite like to revisit if my if I can address my lack of talent.
I don't let that stop you. I haven't. So.
No. So I've got a couple of questions in that I'd like to put to you. The first one actually is alongside the play theme, so we're avoiding work for number one. And it comes from a copywriter called Mark, and he's asked, what's a more satisfying smell? The smell of fresh paint or the smell of the sea?
Ooh, it kind of depends. Do you know, I would swap paint for ink. I love the smell of ink. I'm using rubber-based inks at the moment, and they smell amazing in my print work. So I love that. But I live by the sea. I can smell the sea from my front doorstep, and there's something, I don't know, like the sea is such an amazing thing, so powerful, and so calming, and it just puts everything in perspective. So I like to walk along the shore and smell the sea, and then do a bit of printing with some ink. So that's not a very good answer, is it? I
need to push you off that
I've
fence.
Not binary again. I have to say it's both and, right? It's not either or.
Yeah, there's clearly wonderful things about both.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the second question then. So it's actually from me again this week. I'm being very selfish. As I've listened back to previous episodes, as I mentioned to you pre-recording, I've noticed that I have a tendency, aside from being an aging moany bastard, to focus on negatives around our industry. I guess because I want to try and fix them, or I want everyone to take note and try and fix them. So can you tell me one thing that we can all be really positive about in marketing? Because it might cheer me up.
Pregnant pause here. Do you know what I feel? I think for the first time in quite a while that, and this might just be because of the Twitter chat I'm seeing at the moment, but there does feel like there's a bit of a sea change in that attitude. That there are a lot of people out there trying to move beyond that negativity. People trying to find a better way, and starting to explore ways of definitely not forgetting the past, because I think that's been a criticism I would level at the industry. It's been terrible at looking to its past for inspiration for the future, but actually not just being down into the mud and going, this is all shit and we can't fix it. There actually does feel as if there's a real impetus behind people looking for better solutions and looking for ways to make this a better industry to work in, an industry that creates better work, an industry that has meaning and purpose again in a way that it once did. Because I agree. I think it had lost its way. I think a little, certainly lost its confidence, and I think it does certainly feel that the chatter now is much more around the let's we accept that, but bitching about it isn't going to make it better. Doing stuff about it is going to make it better. So it's encouraging to hear, people who are, I won't take aging off of you, but people who are really keen to see what comes next, but what comes next grounded in what came before. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's get back to the things that are really important, and that is, that's ideas, isn't it? So
yeah, it is. That has cheered me up. Thank thank you. I think I think one of the biggest things is how much creativity and the idea, as you just said, had been devalued as a consequence of many things. There's all sorts of variables at play here, but due to numerous people, I immediately think of Burnett and Field and a few other greats who were doing sterling work. You're right. There has been a shift in people understanding and putting value back to the idea and the creativity, because it's one of the other posters we've got up here. It's one of the the last unfair advantages you can have in business. So and that was lost perhaps, but it's coming back, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the final part of the interview, Murray, is we have our 4 pertinent posers which we put to all of our guests. So what advice would you give to your younger self?
I think I would probably advise myself to spend more time understanding myself. I think the true self-awareness, properly understanding you and what makes you tick and what motivates you, is the key to getting everything you really need and want in life. And I spent a lot of time hiding from myself when I was younger, hiding from the things that I was scared of or that frightened me or that made me unhappy. And I think you've got to face up to those. So I think that would be my key piece of advice would be spend more time getting to know yourself and be a bit kinder.
Number 2 is, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would that be and why?
The bullshit and the lies. I'm fed up of it. The lasting progress only ever comes from being honest. You have to start from a place of honesty, total transparent honesty, and the sooner we can get that, the better. Because there's just too much bollocks being talked. People, flat out lying happening. And those people need to be exposed, and we need to get back to truthful conversations.
Yeah, I think that's actually hit the nail on the head in terms of what I found so refreshing about the recent Bob Hoffman article, was that an agency is a collection of people, and with that combined logic and intelligence, you can solve problems, but you can't be sure that something will or won't work necessarily. You can just tap into the minds and experience that they collectively have, whereas understandably, you want someone to be able to guarantee. So there's people out there guaranteeing something with work. You can understand why people sway towards that person, but it's so flawed. It can't possibly be right, because there's, as we've said, human beings are complex. The industry is complex. Brands are complex. Whether you're, from the School of Edinburgh Bass or more, I guess, the Mark Ritson school of thought, although even those are kind of trending towards each other. You can't. You quite simply can't. You've got methods and processes which should ultimately, the process will become the answer, but you don't know what that answer is yet.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if people are looking for control, but you're operating in a chaotic system, it's not possible to control it. And anybody that tells you they can predict what's going to happen in the future is lying. There's just flat out, nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think that there's so many moving parts in a brand and in a marketing campaign, and so many variables out with your control, that how can you possibly know? All you can do is make informed guesses based on the information you have at hand at that point.
Yes.
That's another element of strategy. Is this is the best guess we can make at the moment. That suggests we should do this and not that. Let's give it a go and see what happens. But importantly, learn from that. Did it work? Did it not work? Why did it work? Why did it not work? And that gives you a more informed position to work from in the future. But but you need to be honest about what you really do and really don't know.
Yes, in the episode where I spoke to Ian Pritchard, we plugged the JWT planning guide that was written by Stephen King way back, which no doubt you're very familiar with. And one of my favourite parts of that is the planning cycle, because it is that constant cycle of, where are we? How did we get there? Where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? But revisiting that where are we state to just evaluate, has it worked? Has it not worked? What have we learned? Right now, what are we going to do? And it is that constant, rather than this is the answer, full stop, that's the end. It is that constant. But I'm sounding negative again. Cheer up. Let's talk about books. I really like books. So what books would you recommend to everyone listening?
Read more sci-fi.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. 100% read more sci-fi. I think that, everybody's reading business books, right? And we've talked about the issues with business books. And in fact, that's even if you can find a good one that isn't just a 10-minute blog post expanded into something they can sell. But sci-fi is basically narrative philosophy, I think. It's imagining what the world could be like if. And I think the beauty of sci-fi is it takes situations out of your known environment and creates a space where people can play with ideas. I'm a massive fan of sci-fi, and I think especially and a fellow Scotsman and sadly missed, but Ian M. Banks's Culture series is probably for me it's the gold standard. It is beautifully imagined. It is thrilling to read, and it is full of massive ideas. And I think that, as we talked about getting the industry back into ideas, let's read books that are full of big ideas.
Excellent. I'm really pleased you said that, actually, because I was wary that the same names typically come up, but that certainly hasn't come up yet. So that's great. Lastly, then, Murray, we always dedicate every show to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass, depending on your point of view, that honour to our guest, who has to give their reason why.
I'd like to do it because the guy who got me into marketing, I was very, very fortunate early in my career to have somebody who took a chance on me and gave me an opportunity to work in this amazing, frustrating, fascinating, awesome industry. And that's a guy called Robin Lambie, who was the marketing director at Macallan Lang's Partnership, and then at the Macallan Glenville PLC, the first guy to really give me a proper chance. And to him and to everybody who came after him, who continued to give me chances. So yeah, thank you, Robin.
Brilliant. Thank you. So as a final call to action, head over to this episode online via calltoaction.co. We've shared links to everything discussed in the last hour. How else can people get more Murray Calder?
Oh, do they really want any? They can get me on Twitter. So I'm at Scott Strat Guy on Twitter. You'll find me on LinkedIn, at the usual places, and the Makery Dunbar on Instagram is where I occasionally post some prints, but mostly my wife's work. So.
Fantastic. Well, we'll link to all of that.
Great, thank you.
So thank you so much, Murray, for joining us. It's been fantastic. It's been refreshing. It's been new and it's been different, and I've loved it. So thank you for giving us your time.
No, you're very welcome, Giles. It's been a pleasure to be on your show, and thanks for asking.
And thanks for everyone who continues to listen and support us here. Please do continue to get in touch with questions to put to our guests and feedback and anything else you want to share simply by emailing us at hello@calltoaction.co.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try and I try and I try and I try. I can't get no call to action. Oh, I can't get no call to action. Yeah.